Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview English author Mr. Greg Lansdowne. Mr. Lansdowne is the author of Stuck on You, The Rise and Fall, and Rise of Panini Stickers, and Panini Football Stickers, the official celebration, a nostalgic journey through the world of Panini. The Stuck on You and The Rise and Fall and Rise of Panini Stickers was also made into an ITV documentary. This interview is separate from the podcast series. The video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog interview with Mr. Lansdowne discussing the history of English football soccer magazines. Hello, Greg. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you please introduce yourself and discuss your trajectory into the world of football?
Yes, I suppose it's a long-winded one, but well, my introduction into the world of football was the fact that my dad and brother were both involved with West Ham United as professionals. They were both players, but by the time I was born, my dad had retired and was a coach at West Ham. My brother was just starting to break into the West Ham first team in the late 70s when I was getting into football. So that obviously meant that football and me and my family went intertwined. And so if I wasn't going to be good enough as a player, I always had it in my head that I wanted to be involved one way or another. And that was going to be as a writer or a researcher. And from the mid-90s, I started football researching on Swedish television. And then at Leicester University, there's a football research centre. So I was lucky to get a place on there to work there. Then I started writing for football websites, when they started blowing up in the late 90s, early noughties. Then I spent a long period in cricket, more than football. But once I wrote Stuck on You, I wrote it in 2014, it came out in 2015. I then got back into football a lot more. So I wrote the two books that you mentioned. I've written loads and loads of articles, appeared on various television shows, podcasts, radio shows. And I'm now a regular writer for Backpass magazine. So my focus is on the nostalgia of football. And as people will have seen on my Twitter account, I've kept all my magazines from when I was growing up, and it's always interesting to put those up and really see if the predictions went on to happen, the players they were touting, did they become those big names, and that seems to get a good reception from people.
Yes. So as you mentioned, most people know you from the Panini books, but those of us who follow you online on Twitter and such, we know you because of the magazines that you mentioned and your extensive collection of football magazines. Can you discuss that part of this magazine collecting passion of yours?
Yeah, it started in 1979, so that was when I got into football, and I think probably the first week I got into football was when Match Weekly launched. So start of September 79, and luckily my parents or my brother as well, they decided that they were going to buy pretty much every single comic or magazine that week, and maybe it was a case of I'd make a choice from there. So you're talking about the first copy of Match Weekly, the first copy of Top Soccer. I definitely got Football Weekly News around that time, Shoot, and Roy the Rovers, and I've got copies of all of those from September 79. It looks like I had to make a choice in terms of I couldn't get them every week, but I got pretty much every copy of Shoot every week from that point for about 15 years. Match was on and off until 83, and then that was every copy of Match from then for another 10 years. Roy the Rovers was every copy from 79 until 89, and then I just dipped in and out of all the other magazines over the years. And unfortunately for my parents and for my wife now, I never got rid of them and never wanted to get rid of them. And you do hear a lot of stories about how parents do throw away their children's collections when they've moved out. But I think I've been quite insistent that that's not going to happen for me.
Very good. Yeah. And as you mentioned, most football fans, I guess, of your generation growing up, it was either shoot or match. And even nowadays online, you'll always see were you a shoot person or a match person. So they seem to be the two magazines that most younger fans gravitated towards. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, in the 70s, shoot didn't really have any competition. Certainly weekly wise, there was the occasional one, but nothing that lasted. So in September 79, that was the first time that shoot really had any competition. And then during the 80s, again, it was only those two in terms of weekly magazines. There was obviously there are weekly comics as well, but even Match struggled to keep up and last the pace with shoot for a long time. And there were at least a couple of times during the 80s when it looked like they wouldn't be able to survive. They just clung on, and then by the time of the early 90s, then all of a sudden they started to not only compete with shoot, but they overtook them in the number of sales. When Match started, it was probably even slightly more grown up than shoot was. But although everybody thinks that shoot and Match were a bit childish in terms of their content, if people actually read shoot from the 70s and the 80s and Match, especially from the start in 79 till probably midway through the 80s, the quality of the content, I mean, and you can just see, because a lot of these journalists went on to write for national newspapers, and it's well worth reading even now. It's as time went on, and then when Match started to become more popular because it targeted a lower age group, shoot then also had to dumb down a little bit and pander to these youngsters, and then the magazines became different, but still massively popular.
Yeah, let's discuss about some of the other competitors. There was a magazine called Goal in the late 60s, early 70s. How did that compare with the shoot or Match?
Well, that was even more grown up. It was it's not a magazine that would be launched now, because it comes across as being very stodgy, and obviously in the digital age you don't need to report things in the same way that you did in the late 60s. But it was basically the older brother of shoot, so it had slightly fewer posters compared to shoot. It wasn't as big on the free gifts and the giveaways, because it was as I say, more of a it had a few free gifts, but it was more of a grown-up publication. And really once shoot launched a year later and became massively popular, it was done by the same publishers, and it was just felt that there was no need to have both of them, so they merged them together, and really there wasn't a lot that although it said incorporated, there wasn't a lot that shoot incorporated from Goal. But probably the most the best known would be reproducing the lineups from the games, although lineups from games played about 6 weeks before in those days. It was only really around the mid 80s that shoot started to produce that started to put the lineups from the previous weekend's games in. So it looks really odd now, where you'll open up a copy of shoot from 1975, and that they'll have the lineups and scores from the late December 1974. It was Match Weekly that were the first to do it timely, and that was one of their big selling points when they launched their match facts in 1979.
And from this period of the 70s, maybe into the early 80s, were there magazines that kind of fell by the wayside, but you think perhaps deserved more of a recognition?
I think any magazine that's launched, I've launched a few magazines in my time, written for a few magazines, and I know how hard it is. It's not just putting together a quality magazine. You've got to try to get it out there and make people aware of it. And before the digital age without any internet, it was even harder. So if people didn't see it in their local shop, then you were almost certainly never going to be aware of it. There were lots of magazines that pandered to certain people, and Top Soccer was an even younger age group compared to Shoot, but done by the same people. And then Soccer Monthly, which is also done by IPC, was a monthly that was aimed at an older age range, and that's got some excellent long form articles. So in a way, it's a shame that one didn't carry on, but there were also other monthly magazines out there, and unfortunately there's only so many you can have. I think the ones that I would have liked to have gone on longer were more in the 90s rather than the 70s and the 80s. So it would have been the reincarnated goal from the mid 90s that only lasted 3 years. And obviously there would have been also many people who would have been sad that 90 minutes only lasted 7 years.
All right. And in this era, like you said, the pre-internet days, where your only source of information is either going to be television or these magazines or maybe daily newspapers, would you say that the likes of Shoot and Match kept you in more or less informed about the news of football?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously there's only so much you can do in a 48 page magazine. So we couldn't know everything about every player, whereas these days it is possible to get everything. So it was information on a light basis compared to now, but it's certainly, if you read those magazines, it certainly meant that you were a step ahead of other football supporters if they weren't reading it. And they did also cover issues within the game. So Shoot was quite vocal on football hooliganism, for example, in the mid 80s, and they even did an interview with a football hooligan. They didn't give any names, but there was a long article about that, and that's about why do they do it. And a few years after that, it was quite that there was a lot of research going into at the Football Research Centre at Leicester. There was extensive research into why people become football hooligans, and Shoot were doing that, and people wouldn't have associated them then with that. And then when there was All-Seater Stadium and club bonds, and they were mentioning all of these as well. And as I say, I just don't think when people look back on them now, it probably depends the era you were reading Shoot and Match. If you were reading Shoot and Match in the 90s, then they were definitely targeting the younger age range by then. But if you were reading before, and if you were to read back again, I would imagine a lot of the articles were probably too advanced for a lot of the readers in the 70s, certainly, and the mid half of the 80s.
Yes. So let's get to the 90s now. There seemed to be a proliferation of football magazines during this decade. Was this because of the interest raised from Italian 90 and the launch of the Premier League, or were these just coincidences, or there were other factors?
Yeah, it was both of those. So in the at the start of the 90s, around Italia 90, that's when 90 Minutes launched, and there were a couple of other publications. There was a new football weekly news, which was in a newspaper format, and there was another one called Free Kick, and all the other magazines were still going, and they were still going strong. I mean, Match reached its peak of sales in the early 90s, and although Shoot was compared to them was on the decline in terms of sales because they weren't doing as well, but they were still doing massively well. And if it was only because Match were doing even better that it seemed that Shoot weren't doing well, but the number of copies they were selling was also outstanding. So it was Italia 90 definitely gave a kickstart to the game in this country. And then, as you say, there was the Premier League. But the Premier League launched in 92, 93, but it wasn't until the summer of 94, then the summer of 95 that there was just this big spurt of the monthly football magazines in the main. So I think it was probably a case of the publishers waiting to see if the Premier League was a success. So they had 92, 93, they had 93, 94, and then they thought, well, clearly this is going to be massive. There's starting to be a few foreign players coming into the game. It was a few years after that until the real big stars started to come in. But so the summer of 94 was obviously 442. That became a massive success quite quickly. So then other publishers had to cotton on and follow on. So IPC then did Goal, and Future did Total Football. And then there are all sorts of other magazines that came up, and 90 Minutes was going strong in the mid 90s, and Football Monthly relaunched, and it was a good time, but for magazines, but it was also clear that something had to give, and there's no way the market could take that many magazines, and as it proved, by the end of the 90s, a lot of these publications have fallen by the wayside.
Yes, 442. That's the magazine that's still around today, and that's the one that's lasted the longest of all those magazines. Somehow, what do you think is about this magazine that is still relevant, while, like you mentioned, all those other magazines launched around the same time, most of them folded?
I think being first to market is always key, and they were the first a year ahead of Goal and Total Football. Obviously, it also had to be a good magazine, and it was a good magazine. It had quality writers, and it launched the career of Amy Lawrence in 94, among others. And it, from the start, it had big names on the cover that got your attention, and it wasn't a case of just having that player or manager on the cover, but having nothing necessarily connected to them. So, for example, with Shoot in the 70s and 80s, you'd have a big name on the cover, but it wouldn't mean that there'd be anything about them in there. It was just an action shot that they'd chosen to put in for that week. Whereas if there was someone on the cover of 442, then you knew that they secured a big name interview. As time went on, it became harder for magazines to get these big name interviews, because, especially once the internet started, because these players could promote themselves. They didn't need the magazines. So these days, a lot of there's not as much appeal for magazines or for players to appear in football magazines, but of them, 442 is still the one that is able to get the big names on the front cover, and as you say, that's why that has sustained, and there are nowhere near as many monthly football magazines as there were, but that's in the digital age. You would expect that to be the case. Yes. I think 442 has certainly changed a lot, and its focus on nostalgia is a lot more than it used to be. So I would say probably approaching half the content, or certainly when you see the names on the front of the cover, who they're featuring, that month, at least half will be players who played in the 80s and 90s, probably because they are a bit easier to get hold of, because they won't be asking for lots of money for the interview.
Right. And we mentioned this a couple of times, the magazine Goal that was launched in 1995. That was one of my favorite magazines at the time. It's a similar format to 442, similar type of writing. And I was surprised that it only lasted a few years. So I was really surprised because I really liked that magazine. And but like you said, there were so many that not all of them lasted. What do you remember from Goal mostly?
Yeah, of those magazines that launched around that time, that was my favorite as well, and that was the one that I religiously got every single month, and I still have every single issue of that magazine. It was a very good magazine, and there was no reflection on them that they folded after 3 years. It was just that there was a downturn in football magazines. It was done by the publishers of 90 Minutes, IPC, and 90 Minutes went the year before. So they obviously saw the writing in the wall on the wall, in terms of there was just too much competition in the weekly magazine, and then there was just too much competition in the monthly magazine. And as I say, it was a good magazine. Maybe it just came out at the wrong time, because there were so many other publications out there at the same time, and it just didn't become viable for them as a publishing company, because that they've got so many different magazines. IPC, that's unless it's not properly washing its face, then it has to go.
Yeah, there was another one launched around the same time, similar format, Total Football. What are your thoughts on that magazine, and why it folded just like the others?
Yeah, it went a little bit longer than Goal, and yeah, it just became, there's only so much, especially when you're a UK centric football magazine. There was only so much that you can cover and write about. So it just, in the end, it was inevitable that these magazines were duplicating themselves. And although they all tried to have their little quirks, in the end, it just, you would go in the shelves and look at them and think, oh, well, what's the difference between that one and that one and that one and that one? And it was just a case of something had to give, and the golden age of print magazines had gone, because more and more people were going on the internet, and then as time went on, they were getting these stories on their phone as well. And so, as I say, now it's inevitable, and I think it's credit to the magazines that are going now, and that there's still, if you go to the news agents over here, there's still a decent section of football magazines. So it's credit to them that they are able to survive at a time where you've got everything, not necessarily all the top quality journalism, but you certainly got all the information at the touch of a button.
Around 1995, I bought a few copies of a magazine called The Game, and I'm sure that must have disappeared very shortly after, maybe a few months later. Now, in our written interview portion, you mentioned that you had not come across this magazine. And what are your thoughts on it, having now seen a few copies?
Yeah, it looks like it was another good magazine. You look at the list of contributors, and there are lots of top quality ones there. They've gone on to have a long career in football, and it was just a case of, because it wasn't the internet was only just started. I certainly didn't have the internet for certainly at my home until the late 90s. So it's not something I would have been able to come across there. And if a magazine wasn't in your local news agents or further afield, or WH Smith, they didn't sell magazines in supermarkets in those days. So if it wasn't on your shelf, you weren't going to know about it, almost certainly, and that was clearly the case with the game. But it does look like a good magazine. But I mean, there's another one's just come into my head. Club Europe also launched around the mid-90s as well. So, and I was aware of that one, but I'm not even sure that one was on my magazine shelves every month. I think it would pop up once, and then a few months later it would pop up again. But the other ones, they hadn't stocked, and there was just too much at the time.
All right. Now let's shift to international football coverage. Now, World Soccer since 1960 has been the main source of international football coverage. I'm assuming in England to this day, and as someone living in the United States, I mean, I can attest to the depth of its coverage in those, like you said, pre-internet days, and it was required reading for sure for football fans like myself. And can you talk about your own experiences with this magazine?
Yeah, I first bought a copy in 1983, and then I think it was probably because I was only 9 at the time. It was probably a bit too grown up with the at that point with the long form. As a 9-year-old, you want to see a few more pictures, and it was all in black and white, and just looked a bit too serious as a 9-year-old. But from 85, 86, I started buying it on a regular basis, and I barely missed a copy since. It obviously doesn't have the wide appeal that it did before the internet, because there's so on. Probably it's not even the internet. It was just as time went on, more and more people started to get interested in the game all around the world. Whereas prior to probably, I wrote for a website called onefootball.com in the early 2000s. I think that was outside of world soccer. That was probably the first time where it was possible for people in England to get long form features and extensive news on countries all over the world. And I think from that point, the internet did coverage of world football and European football much better. And I think it's inevitable that world soccer was never going to get up to the amount of sales that it once did. But the World Cup preview issue, the Euro preview issues are still really must reads, because that's the perfect way to get a lot of information into your head. Whereas to read a massive preview online with just of 32 teams and all the player profiles was just give me a headache thinking about it. So that's where magazines still stand out. But in terms of the month-to-month basis, getting world soccer and reviewing the previous month of Italian football or Spanish football, it's difficult for them to really set the agenda now. Of course, magazines can move subjects on, but when you've also got the Athletic as well now, which covers everything to the nth degree, it's just very hard. And it's a testament to world soccer that it has found a way to still survive in this day and age.
Now, when you were as a growing new football fan, let's say young people your own age, do you think they do you think they mostly read Shoot and Match and maybe sometimes World Soccer, or was World Soccer more geared for the older, more serious football fans?
Yeah, I mean, it was just the length of the articles and the way that they covered it. It's not to say that Shoot and Match certainly early on didn't cover football seriously, but it's just obviously, I mean, World Soccer also had more pages. to get across it. It was just it was, I think it was really for the football geek, the football nerd, world soccer, and you had to be really passionate
Right.
about, so to read in the 80s, that there weren't many people reading in the UK, reading long form articles about football in Russia or Yugoslavia or Scandinavia. As I say, you had to be really mad keen to want to
Right.
be interested. But if you were and you did read them, then certainly you were very good in football quizzes. You were very useful
Yeah.
for that, and you never know when it might come in handy. And it certainly developed, like as with the Panini sticker albums, the World Cup and Euro albums. It certainly developed my geographical knowledge.
Yes, it certainly is a source of, like you said, it's like a source of wealth of information about foreign leagues
Mm.
that I'm assuming may not have been covered to greater depth in other avenues.
Mm.
So yeah. Nowadays, football with social media, internet, television, I mean, football's everywhere. And you just need to go on Twitter, and in 5 seconds, you know everything that's going on, basically.
Mm.
Now, given that, do you think that it was inevitable that football magazines would slowly die out?
Sadly, yeah, and as the generations go on, I've got young kids, and they're just not as interested in reading. Sadly, there are exceptions, but in general, they're not as interested in reading. They've got everything at the touch of a button. As my kids get older, I'm sure they'll be on their phones as well. And obviously, you can read on the phone, you can read on the internet, but most of what they're reading is they're not reading long form articles, are they? So there's definitely, as with the comeback of vinyl records, there's definitely a market for it, for print magazines, and it's a niche market, sadly, these days, and some will survive, but the heyday of print magazines is long gone. But as I say, there is still definitely room for some of them. So hopefully world soccer can survive, that there are still 3 Match the Day, Kick, and Match still going in the kids weekly sector. So some kids are still buying it, but normally there's the it's the free gifts on the front with the kids magazines that are really enticing them in, as rather than the content, because you probably won't find an article of more than 200 words in one of those magazines these days. And Back Pass is still going and still going strong, and I think that obviously appeals to an older audience who grew up with football magazines. So that's probably more of the market. The same with When Saturday Comes. That's also read by people who grew up with football magazines, and they're carrying on that tradition.
Yeah. It's a shame that young people will never know what it felt like to go to a newspaper stand in excitement to get the new issue of your favorite magazine. And yeah, that's one of my favorite memories of a new growing football fan, is that. And sadly, that's gone for the new generation. And
Yeah, I mean, they won't find it sad. It's more us
yes,
who find it sad. They're more than happy with the digital age that they're growing up in. But conversely, I just know that I'm happy that I grew up in the time that I grew up in, going to the newsagent, seeing the vast array of football magazines and football comics, and having the chance to purchase one or two, and no, as you say, and then bringing it back. And I think the point is, with football magazines and comics at the time, that you were learning a lot when you open them, whereas because all the information's out there, and you get to watch games if you want to, you could watch 2 or 3 games a day every day of the week now. So nothing is a mystery. Whereas when I was growing up, you at the very start that there were no live league games. The only live games that you had each year would have been the FA Cup final and a European final if a British team was in it, and then the World Cup and the Euros. Although even Euro '84, because England weren't in it, there was only a couple of live games on then. So you were starved and you didn't really know these faces properly. Whereas now, every team is on, even the lower divisions. So if you really want to know these faces and know about them, then you will. But there was definitely more of a need for them. But there is also a need in a different way, because people should be reading rather than be on their phones all the time now as well.
All right. Now, for yourself, did you enjoy reading football magazines in your formative years as a new football fan, or do you enjoy it more now as an adult where you're a knowledgeable fan of many decades? Which were the favorite times for you?
Oh, it was then learning. It's not to say I don't enjoy it now, but because I've got young kids, I don't really get much. I don't get anywhere near as much chance as I used to. You know, it's a lot easier when you're a kid, when you can just buy a magazine and read it from cover to cover and not be disturbed by everyone. I think your parents are happy that you're reading a magazine from cover to cover and not disturbing them. So it was a different time. Yeah, I mean, it was a great time, but even when I started in '79, that end of that specific year was a great time, because Match Weekly launched. Even Football Weekly News, which went for a couple of years, was a decent publication when you look back, more for an older age range, but that was still good to get. Roy the Rovers, I loved. Tiger comic as well. There was Scoop. There was something for everyone. And just when I look back on them now, it just brings back so many of the covers I can remember to this day. Just synonymous with that time, and it was, and because I then grew up to be a football writer, these were the magazines and comics that inspired me. So it's because of those that I became what I did.
So, in closing, in England, which decade, I should say, was the golden age of football magazines, you think?
In terms of depth, I would say the '90s, because although the '80s was a golden era, because Shoot and Match were competing with each other and trying to outdo each other, they were brilliant magazines. There just wasn't a lot outside of that. But the '90s, and I know quantity doesn't always mean quality, but there were lots of top quality magazines in that time, and Shoot and Match were still going, albeit pandering to a younger audience. The '90s was the launch of 90 Minutes, which was one of the greatest magazines ever in the UK. It had a relatively short lifespan of 7 years, but anyone who read it, anyone who was looking for something to evolve from Shoot and Match into, that was a perfect publication. Fanzines had started to sprout up in the '80s, so the '90s was also a golden era for fanzines, which included When Saturday Comes, which was selling now in the mainstream by then. Then in the mid '90s, you got the advent of 442, then Goal and Total Football. Match the Day was a weekly, then it became a monthly. Football Monthly came back. I've missed out. Like Club Europe was a good magazine, and I've missed out lots on top of that. So if you're a football fan and there wasn't a football magazine for you, then I'm not sure. I'm not sure what was going on, because there really was something for everyone, and it launched the careers of a lot. And even Loaded magazine covered football quite extensively. in a different way, more lifestyle features, and footballers became to be featured in that way more from the introduction of Loaded magazine. So, and then the newspapers started to cotton on, and I think it was because of because of the magazines, because of the likes of 442 and Goal, that the newspapers realised that they've got to up their game, and they've got to be writing in this way and doing these long form interviews. So because of the monthly magazines, that's why we've now got the type of coverage that we have in the newspapers. So yeah, I think the 90s, in many ways, it started the writing careers of many top football journalists who are still at the peak of their game now.
Yes. Well, once again, I'd like to thank you for this interview, and remind everyone to please read the main blog written interview portion as well for more detail. The link is included on the video upload description, along with our respective contact information. So Greg, thank you again.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.